Digital technology and social media have made it much easier for journalists to get started, to found new outlets, and to do their work. That's clear. But there are still pressures that can make it really, really difficult for the kind of in-depth, investigative, prolonged, expert journalism that global muckrakers do. So we're going to talk in this section a little bit about those kinds of pressures and what are the obstacles that global muckrakers face. There's one way we can think about it to make it easier, which is really hard pressures versus soft pressures. Soft pressures would be those pressures that are problematic, but they're not life-threatening. So for example, lack of resources inhibits muckraking in many ways. If journalists are paid low salaries, it becomes really hard to hire expert journalists, and it can become hard to retain them in their jobs. So you remember how we talked in last week about oil reporters. It's a really in-depth kind of journalism. It needs a lot of expertise, but if an outlet is poor and can't pay for it, then it's hard to get good journalists and keep them. Other things that can happen is journalists end up getting paid by their sources, or they take bribes from their sources or from companies, and they get paid to publish certain pieces or to not publish certain pieces. And that inevitably taints the journalism. When an outlet is poor, it can be hard to pay for journalists to travel, so they can't get to places, and they don't have time to dig deeply into a subject, right? You need a well-staffed outlet that can let their reporters take off time and do research for long periods of time. And if journalists are covering dangerous subjects, as many global muckrakers do, they may need insurance. Or if they're traveling, they may need fixers and helpers and minders who can help them navigate where they're going and the different communities and cultures that they encounter and help them get information. And if media outlets are reporting something controversial, then they probably need to pay for lawyers. They may get sued. Huge company with deep pockets may come after them. They may sue the reporter. They may sue the outlet. So they need funding. So really, the bottom line is that a lack of resources aggravates the power asymmetry which exists between journalists and the governments and businesses that they cover. And in those situations, journalists become vulnerable. So muckraking can thrive when people pay for it, but it's expensive, and it's really hard to find ways to pay for it. So what typically media outlets do is they look for multiple sources of funding. And there's all of these funding options actually affect free expression. So there's really a connection between funding for journalism and muckraking and the problems that we're talking about this week of free expression, and even journalism freedom and journalism safety. So traditionally, funding for journalism came from a few places. There was advertising, subscriptions from readers, and from owners of media outlets who sometimes subsidized or helped pay for different media outlets. And of course, in some cases, there was government funding or support as well. All of these options had advantages and disadvantages. For example, a media outlet that is funded by a deep-pocketed owner is probably going to have to follow the agenda of the owner, and that owner may try to influence what information is actually published. There's lots of examples of this around the world, for good and for evil. Think of the abolitionists who helped fund E.D. Morell's reporting on conditions in the Congo. Or look at how Rupert Murdoch, the Australian media tycoon who owns Fox News, has radically affected their political view. Owners often end up dictating the slant of a media outlet in subtle ways or in more direct ways. And this is true whether the outlet is owned by the government ownership or private individuals or interests. There are clearly safeguards. I don't want to overgeneralize and say that media outlets that are owned by somebody or government are always tainted, but very often there becomes a sort of case of capture or bias that becomes that results from the ownership. Turning to advertising. Advertising is a really common way of funding media, and that's still true, although the prices of advertising have collapsed because of the internet, but it has some disadvantages. Advertisers very often try to influence coverage. They don't want critical coverage of their companies. It's extremely common for advertisers to pull ads or threaten to pull ads if they're unhappy with the editorial coverage of a media outlet. Traditionally, news outlets tried to build a wall between advertisers and the news department so that the advertiser could not have too much influence. Ideally, journalists didn't really know what the advertisers were doing or planning or spending money on, and they couldn't be influenced by them. Now, With online publishing, there's very often a blurring of editorial and advertising content. Journalists are doing now all kinds of things that they wouldn't have done before. So the native advertising or the paid content or advertising that's sort of advertorial, which is there to promote a product or a company or a point of view, it's not necessarily there to provide objective and honest information. And even when those kinds of articles / ads are labeled, it's very, very hard for readers to actually distinguish. Studies have shown over and over again that readers can't really tell the difference a lot of the time between native advertising or paid content. The other point is that, again, because of the internet, the price of advertising has collapsed. And so this has weakened many media outlets that just can't get the funding that they used to get from the advertising. Subscriptions have traditionally supported media. And in Europe, about 50% of newspaper revenue came from subscriptions. In the US, it was less. It was more advertising dependent. And in regions with less advertising, like, for example, many parts of Africa, newspapers were dependent on circulation. And there is, again, a trade-off. Being dependent on circulation can mean freedom from advertising pressures, which is great, but it can also lead to lower quality because outlets start competing for readership, and so they start printing the more sort of entertaining or trivial news because they want to get readers. The rise of digital technology and the internet may in some ways have made this problem worse because attempts to appeal to readers means a sort of race to the bottom with more kind of gossip, more celebrity stories. And that kind of coverage is not conducive to global muckraking. One of the definitions of global muckraking is that it should serve what economists would call a public good. And good journalism should make a difference, it should change the world for the better, and it takes a lot of time and effort to produce. Involves going through documents, sifting through records, talking to people, and multiple sourcing. Because the internet has lowered the barriers to entry for new publications, there are more outlets, but audiences are extremely fragmented. And therefore, it's actually much harder to make money than it was, and especially hard to find ways to fund global muckraking. So bottom line is, in general, a combination of revenue from diversified sources helps support global muckraking. And when we look back at the original muckrakers, it was a combination of subscriptions and advertising that freed them to do major investigations. So again, why are we discussing money in a segment on freedom of expression and journalism safety? And the answer is because without funding, there is no hope for sustained global muckraking. The huge asymmetry of power between journalists, companies, and governments means that it's really easier to put pressure on journalists if media outlets are weak and underfunded. Another point, which will come up in some of the conversations we're having this week, underfunded media outlets hire more freelancers, and they are often inexperienced and they lack training, they don't have insurance, and they don't have support in dangerous areas. These freelancers are more vulnerable to being beaten up or killed in dangerous regimes. And this, of course, is a nice tie-in to the whole problem of hard pressures. In many countries in the world, journalists are subject to strong criminal libel or defamation laws. Singapore and Malaysia are two examples of countries that put legal pressures on journalists. British libel laws are also famous. There's also plenty of repressive regimes with strong government control where journalists are afraid to step out of line. So these would include China, Turkey, Vietnam, Russia, Egypt, Cuba, and Venezuela. In these and many other countries, journalists are jailed and killed, and often to make an example, to scare other journalists from trying the same kinds of stories. Non-governmental groups can really threaten journalists as well. Think about ISIS, right? They kill journalists in order to create terror and to make a statement that they can do that. So it depends on what definition you use for journalists, but by some estimates, more than 70 journalists are killed each year. Clearly, one of the most dangerous places for journalists is war zones. So the Middle East is very dangerous right now, especially ISIS-controlled areas. But anywhere that criminal gangs work and places where the police or government are corrupt and cahoots with local mafias, those areas can become very dangerous for journalists. Drug dealing, for example, can make it much worse. In areas in Mexico where the drug dealers, the drug cartels are very powerful and often working with local authorities, there's unbelievable pressure on journalists. Journalists are often afraid to report, and they can get killed if they do report. In the past, Colombia had huge problems with press freedom, especially during their war with the drug cartels. In Russia, dissent is really not tolerated. A corrupt and politicized court system penalizes the few journalists who are brave enough to challenge the government's narrative. Since 2014 in Russia, more and more laws have been passed allowing the government to block access to websites and require bloggers with more than 3,000 daily viewers to register with the government. This pretty much bans personal blogs and anonymous commentary. Numerous journalists have been arrested, injured, and killed, and the perpetrators are usually not prosecuted, according to the Committee to Protect Journalists, the Press Freedom Organization. Places where killers of journalists are not punished are what we call places of impunity. So what have we learned in this segment? The political and legal climate affects whether global muckrakers can do their work. Funding is essential to support global muckraking because media outlets that are well-funded can often stand up to pressure. Journalists in many parts of the world face lawsuits, violence, and death for doing their jobs. We're going to be hearing more from our guest speakers about these subjects.